Welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast, presented by Orion Advisor Solutions and hosted by Dr. Daniel Crosby, Orion's Chief Behavioral Officer and New York Times best-selling author. Each week, Dr. Crosby interviews a fascinating new guest on a range of compelling topics, from literature to psychology to financial wellness. To learn more about Dr. Crosby's behavioral finance work at Orion, visit www.orion.com.
Hey everyone, Dr. Daniel Crosby here with some exciting news. Ascend 2025 is just around the corner. This year's theme, All In, perfectly aligns with the deep dive we'll take into how behavioral finance can elevate your business and strengthen client relationships. Plus, don't miss the pre-conference Orion Advisor Academy where you can earn multiple hours of CE credit in one place. I'm excited to meet you all, lead the in-depth BFI sessions you love, and explore the latest tools and strategies to help you and your clients go all in on achieving their financial goals. Register now at orion.com/ascent and let's go all in together. Hello and welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel Crosby, and I'm joined today by another good doctor, Dr. Christina Lynn, a practice management consultant at Mariner. She specializes in the psychology of financial planning, divorce finances, estate planning, and digital assets. Her financial planning style can be described as holistic and evidence-based with a focus on life planning and innovation. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dr. Crosby. Happy to be here.
Okay, we got to go to first names now. It's too formal. We're friends now. We got to go to first names. I don't recognize Dr. Crosby, but thank you. It's great to have you here. You've been pushing some great content on your LinkedIn, which is where I found some of your work, and I'm excited to have a chance to talk with you about it. The first thing I want to talk about is this sort of false dichotomy of hard versus soft skills. You know, I think a lot of times we talk about hard and soft skills as if they're completely disparate things and as though, quote unquote, soft skills don't have hard impact. But you talk about the fact that emotional connection often outweighs more conventional tactical strategies when it comes to advisors closing business. Can you talk about this? Some examples of where emotional connection can play a decisive role when it comes to sales?
Yeah, I actually wanted to give you a common example that we see of the opposite case where advisors are losing business prospects because they aren't establishing an emotional connection, because that's what we're hearing in training. When I'm meeting with advisors and they're giving examples about really good cases, how they have quantified their value very clearly, showing them why it would make sense to work with them because of the investment planning they're proposing, the tax planning, the estate plan, whatever is their pain point, but yet they're not winning the business. And it's a mystery. Like, why is this happening? So I get to hear that sort of conversation in the back channels and hear them think about, well, what could they have done better in order to win that prospect? And my suggestion is actually the opposite of what they're often thinking. They're expecting us to give advice like, oh, make sure to always show this cash flow analysis graph in every meeting, or try, presenting from this angle instead. My job in a meeting is to bring in a training session is to bring up how the importance of the emotional connection. Do you think you connected with the prospect? And if I were to phone the prospect up and ask them, hey, how did you connect with this advisor? What would their answer be? I think that that's actually the missing case in some of these like mysteries that advisors are missing out on.
So it can't be overstated. I think so first of all, I really like one thing you said there about sort of imagining, like this person has now left my office. If someone were to phone them and say, hey, how'd that go? Like, what was the level of rapport in a completely candid conversation? what would they say? Because I think it often wouldn't go as well as we'd like. The other thing that has to be said from a behavioral perspective, I think a lot of times we operate as though we are rational decision makers with a side of emotion, when in fact, we are emotional decision makers with a side of rationality. And we feel first, and then we really sort of retrofit or back into the rational parts of it. So the rational part of your offer, of your pitch, just has to be good enough, candidly. And the emotional part is everything.
Yeah, I can't agree more. And that can be a difficult concept for advisors to grasp because they are so good at the rational piece. They have brilliant ideas for how to save them money in taxes and how to, increase their rate of return or give more, suitable, income producing strategies. They're really good at that. They're good at finding the holes in plans and coming up with solutions that it can be confusing to them that there's actually this other side of it that they're not working on. They're not investing the time in learning how to better connect with people. Rather, they're investing the time in learning those technical pieces of it. Like, how can I, improve my tax planning expertise?
And, you go so far as to suggest that this even mediates trust in a relationship. This even loads onto how we form trust as well. We know we work in one of the most sensitive parts of our clients' lives. Of course, money is very touchy and trust is paramount there. And again, you and your research suggest that these emotional connections are more likely to build trust than even competence or ethics, which is not to say that you should be unethical or incompetent, but only to understand the power of connection. How practically can advisors shift this focus? I think we've covered this now, that there's this tendency there to do this. How practically can advisors shift their focus from showcasing the meat and potatoes, the blocking and tackling, to fostering deep emotional connections with their clients?
Yeah. So that study that you were referencing is not my own work. It was a study by Vanguard, and it just highlights the perception that advisors tend to have, which is that we think that a prospect or a client, the trust that they place in us is mostly founded in how good of a job we can do, right? The letters behind our name, our number of years of experience, our investment solution platform, things like that. When actually studies show that the trust, the majority of trust that is placed in us by prospects and clients has more to do with that emotional connection. And to answer your question about how can we shift into practically tapping into investing more in the emotional connection, I'm a financial planner in my background. I, also trained as an academic, but I'm not the world's leading, researcher on emotional intelligence or the emotional connection, which is why I looked to research, because I want to know what has already been proven to work. I don't want to just make something up that sounds good or whatever I think will work. So I spent a while searching for a solution that can be teachable and is clear cut and can be assessed in a conversation, and we know to work. And the solution that I found was motivational interviewing. It's an evidence-based conversation style that has been shown in hundreds of studies to affect positive change in clients. And so I'm really tapping into all sorts of different of the tenets that motivational interviewing teaches in order to apply those practical next steps for advisors.
Okay, so now you're speaking my language really and truly with the motivational interviewing stuff. So for the layperson who's not a Ph.D., what is motivational interviewing? Give us sort of the motivational interviewing 101. What's it based on, and what does it look like in practice?
Okay, so motivational interviewing is essentially just a conversation style that you have with clients. So it's not limited to just the mental health profession, which is where it originated. It can be used by any helping profession. So coaches are using this. A lot of people in the healthcare professions are using this. Now people in financial planning are using this. But again, it's this conversation style that follows a certain set of techniques that are observable, and you can score them, like how well did you adhere to these techniques. So some of the high level things that motivational interviewing teaches is that in a conversation, there are two experts in the room, okay? Not just the expert, the advisor, and the client, the person who needs your help. There's an expert, the wealth advisor, and then there's the expert, the prospect, who is the expert of their own lives, right? So it's about embodying this spirit of partnership and acceptance and autonomy and evocation. Those are the 4 spirits principles of motivational interviewing. And so when you're having a conversation, you want to embody those 4 things. Ways to do that, you're using the OARS techniques, the open-ended questions, the affirmations, the reflections, the summaries. Another big piece of motivational interviewing is what they used to refer to as rolling with resistance. And that's now they frame it as reining in the fix-it reflex. And this is a difficult concept for advisors because we're used to showing up in meetings as being the expert, because that is what you all are. You're very brilliant and good at what you do. But how we tend to show up in meetings is to just use it too much, use our expert. We fall into what they call the expert trap. We're fixing problems too quickly, and we're not spending as much time as needed into the beginning part of the meeting, which should be around developing a relationship, really understanding their perspective, reinforcing their autonomy, that sort of thing. So is that clear as mud?
So I'm going to have you go back and do the 4 again in just a minute, because I want to drill down a little bit there. But for listeners who haven't yet checked it out, go check out the Orion Advisor Academy course called Communicating with Empathy, which has a whole unit on rolling with resistance, which I think is a really powerful principle. So autonomy, evocation. Do I have those 2? I think I missed 2. What are the other 2? Autonomy, evocation, and what were the other 2?
Partnership and acceptance. And by the way, I watched that course. Very good. Highly recommend it.
So accepting that there's another person who is an expert in their own life and their own experience sitting across the table from you. And rather than descending from on high with all the answers, asking questions in a way that's going to evoke that expertise and treat them as an equal. I think that's really powerful. And it's actually a nice segue into our next question. I read some research a while back that has really stuck with me about the number one reason people fail to present to advisors' offices, and it was the fear of being judged. It was the fear that they would be condescended to or judged harshly when they sort of, open up the statements and show that advisor what they've been doing. And I think that's fair. And I think one thing that can exacerbate that unintentionally sometimes is the discovery process itself, like the way we go about asking questions, the way we go about trying to get information can feel a little bit like a 3rd degree, can feel a little bit judgy, to use the scientific term. What strategies do you have? What have you observed about the discovery process? Where does it go wrong? What can we do to make it go right?
Yeah, it's so natural for an advisor to show up in a discovery meeting and just ask a lot of questions. It's not that they're doing anything wrong. They have very good intentions, right? They are very good at what they do, and they need to ask certain questions in order to customize the plan in order to, help them achieve their goals. So it makes sense that we ask a lot of questions in the discovery meeting. But like you said, there are unintended consequences of that. Like, we don't mean to make them feel uncomfortable, but it just happens. And the good news is that motivational interviewing does offer some, just the protocol of how you have a conversation mitigates that in a way. One of the ways that it does that is my favorite. It's the ratio between reflections to questions that it recommends. So they recommend that there's about 2 reflections to every 1 question. And I think we all know what a reflection is. I think we just don't use them very often. I think it just takes practice. And that's, what I'm working on with advisors is actually building that muscle up so that we use more reflections than we do questions. So just to kind of go back and talk about what a reflection is, it's that just saying back to somebody what we think that they've said. And that can be simple or it can be complex. A simple reflection is just literally kind of like parroting back what you've heard them, maybe using a different word. A complex reflection is guessing what they might have meant under the surface. So if a reflection is an iceberg, a simple reflection is just what you see above the water, what they've already identified. And a complex reflection is better, and that is guessing what's underneath the surface. And the key to that is probably, I don't need to say this, but I feel like I do because they're so important, is you don't end it with your voice inflecting up. You end with it inflecting down. And what that does is it puts the prospect or the client at ease in a sense, because like we talked about, too many questions can feel like an interrogatory. Where you give a reflection instead, it's sort of like you're inviting them to try on whatever you've said and to clarify it. It's sort of, without saying this, you're actually communicating to them that I care about you and I'm interested in learning about you more, that I'm trying to dig deeper here.
So that simple reflection is effectively, so what I hear you saying is, X, Y, Z. That complex reflection is extrapolating, kind of reading the subtext, giving it back to them for their approval or dismissal. Something that I would say to folks from my time as a therapist, where of course these skills are very much at play. I think there can be a fear as you're starting to get this going that you'll be wrong. When you make that complex reflection, you will have misunderstood them or you will have misarticulated what they meant, and you will be wrong, right? Like from time to time, you will be wrong, but I'll tell you it won't matter, because that person, the experience of being deeply listened to is so foreign to most of us who sort of breeze through this hectic, overscheduled world where everyone's sort of in their own head and half listening and distracted. The fact that someone is trying to understand you, even when they get it wrong, people are happy to clarify. People are happy to make themselves better understood. So the rightness or wrongness of that extrapolation should matter very little to you. And what should matter is that effort, because there's so much magic in being listened to and having someone even wrestle with trying to understand you is so powerful.
Yeah, and that is exactly what they teach. They call it trying on. So I make a wild guess as to what you're meaning, and you get to try on like that, what my guess is. Does that feel right to you? And there's like this magical thing that happens, and they tend to, just like you said, respond by correcting you or agreeing with you. And while you're doing that, what's happening behind the scenes is you're getting them to think, to get out of their head and into their heart, right? And that's what creates an emotional connection.
So I think one of the skills that differentiates sort of the black belts from the white belts with respect to interpersonal skills is another one that I've seen you talk about, and that was talked a lot about in my psychotherapeutic training, which is the importance of silence in client conversations. Now, this is, again, it cannot be overstated, so awkward in our day-to-day conversations for there to be any sort of silence. The tendency is for us to fill that immediately, to run away from it, to avoid it, to go, well, see ya. But yet you say that silence is powerful. These pregnant pauses are powerful in a client-advisor interaction. Can you talk to us about the source of this power and then how we can use them more effectively with clients?
Yeah, and I have heard you talk about this, and that's a big reason what's got me thinking about that and incorporating it into our training. Because again, it's counterintuitive. Like we're showing up as the expert, right? And it's our job to carry the conversation and to avoid those awkward silences. And I also hear this a lot. Well, they're paying me for my advice. I should be talking the whole time, right? Well, what's the reason for the silence? The reason for the silence is that when we respond too quickly, we interrupt their train of thought. Our prospects and clients are often thinking about these things for the first time. Like they're not going home to their family and talking about complex financial situations and questions. And you're bringing this up to them. They need a chance to process. And they process by talking out loud. There's one questionologist, his name is Warren Berger. He says it this way: silence sucks the truth out. When you allow for that pregnant pause, they're working behind the scenes thinking, and then you let them talk and ramble a bit. As they're talking, they're figuring out what they actually think. They need that opportunity to spit those words out and weave them together and kind of sift through what they mean and don't mean and what they figure out what they actually want, right? That's why silence is so important. And I'd say it's even more important when you're working with somebody who's soft-spoken or an introvert. We hear from advisors that it can be like even more awkward working with those types of people because, they have to carry the conversation more. But actually, again, counterintuitive, that's where silence is even more important because those types of people may need extra time to think or even get up the courage to say what they are thinking out loud because they might be a little bit intimidated.
I think, one of the things that I'm taking away from our conversation, there is a qualitative difference between how conversations happen out in the world and how conversations should happen within the walls of your financial planning practice. Out in the world, conversations move so fast, I think partially because when the other person's talking, we're thinking more about how we're going to respond than what they're saying, or we're engaging at such a shallow, superficial level that it's just like, hey, how you doing? Good. Busy? You? Good. Doing anything fun? Yep. Going on vacation? Cool. See ya. I mean, it's like these are like paint by number conversations. These are scripted. I mean, there is a social script. And look, if you deviate from it, you're weird, right? Like if you bump into someone at the grocery store, they don't want to hear your life story. It's weird. You shouldn't do that. But likewise, if you're sitting in front of someone, who may be going through a divorce, who may have suffered a loss, like a lot of the times when money is in motion with us and our clients, it's around a really significant life event. And your conversation should look qualitatively different, right? There should be greater depth. There should be less speed. There should be more thoughtfulness. There should, like you said, 2 reflections for every question. I think all of these things are a good reminder to the listeners of just how different a deep conversation should look from sort of a casual, a casual bump into someone at the Little League game. Another thing I've seen you write about is something that I actually have a chapter or two about in The Soul of Wealth, which everyone should go buy, frankly, right? Mm-hmm. You talk about helping clients visualize their goals. And I talk about this, salience is so important. And one of the places I think where we fall down in planning a lot of times is by having our goals be sort of black and white. They're just sort of lifeless.
Mm-hmm.
What do you do to increase the vividness, the salience, the realness of clients' goals and help them visualize them?
So I've heard you talk about this. Specifically, Amy Mullen was a guest on your podcast, and she had some great ideas. And what I really learned from you talking about this was that we can employ tapping into the emotional connection at different points in the planning process. It's not just that beginning phase where you're really understanding their perspective. It can be during the planning process where you are uncovering their goals. And one of the things that you talked about was identifying the emotion that's underneath the goal. And, that might seem like sort of squishy, like, oh, is that really that important? But what it's doing is it's establishing an emotional connection with your client. You're getting the client to think out of their head and into their heart, right? You're building trust by doing that. And one of the challenge with this is we're not really that good at identifying emotions as human beings. We're just, that's sort of a skill that you don't think about working on. For example, if you asked me how I was feeling today, I might say, well, I feel like I should be getting this done, or, I feel like that was really, too bad that this happened that way. Those aren't feelings. Those are judgments, opinions. We're not used to identifying what a true emotion looks like. And so I think that one practical way we can get better at that is by looking at an emotions word bank. It sounds kind of nerdy. Maybe all you nerds out there might think that's cool. Like maybe you and I do, but I go to the nonviolent communication word bank now and then when I'm struggling with something to identify the emotion that I'm feeling. I think by building out that vocabulary and using it at these opportune moments during the planning process, such as when you're talking about goal planning and visualizing a goal, it's very powerful. So that I think that can be really helpful, just building out our vocabulary and identifying emotions throughout the planning process. And just like you said, you're not going to get the guess right on the first time, and that's okay. Let them try on your best guess.
I think behavioral finance sort of overcorrected on emotion. I mean, we know that there are certainly times in the planning process and the investing process where you want to divest it of emotion. Mm-hmm. But there are also just as surely other parts of the process where a sprinkle or even a heavy dose of emotion is exactly what you need. And I think goals are that very thing, right? Because I don't know that we respect this enough. Every single thing we ask our clients to do is hard. Saving, investing, self-denial in the moment in service of a future self we're ill-acquainted with, taking on uncertainty and risk in hopes of a hoped for future reward, denying ourselves today to make tomorrow better. Like, none of these things are things that come easy to the human animal. And I think the only way that we're able to say no to all the temptations along our financial paths is if we have a bigger yes burning inside of us in the form of that goal. And so, yeah, you maybe want to make the asset allocation process rather emotionless, but the goal setting process, they should be ready to run through a wall. So I think, I think you have to pick and choose where you want to apply that emotion in the process. As we start to wrap up here, you've done some work with EQ, or emotional intelligence, and you've even developed a financial planning emotional intelligence scorecard. And I'm grateful anytime we get some sort of practical tools. So can you at least first tell us briefly what EQ is? Like, what is emotional intelligence? Why does it matter for advisors? And then what specifically are you doing with your workshops and your scorecard?
So EQ is emotional intelligence, and it's not like IQ, where we're born with a finite level of IQ, more or less. No matter how much Sudoku I play, I'm not going to get that much higher of IQ. EQ, emotional intelligence, is your ability to verbally and non-verbally connect with somebody, and that can be improved. There's science behind that. Okay, so that's very exciting. And how much time do you spend improving your technical skills compared with improving your emotional intelligence skills? We tend to really dominate in the technical skill development and sort of ignore the emotional intelligence skills, kind of like assuming that, well, you're born with that, or, I'm already good at this, I can't get any better kind of thing. No matter where you're at on the spectrum of emotional intelligence, you can improve that in order to enhance your ability to show up with clients, enhance that client experience. And also a bonus here is it's also going to help you improve your relationships at home if you use these skills with your family and your friends. So, practicing at home is one way to improve these skills. Another way is to have an environment at work where you practice these skills in training and get feedback. And that's what I have the privilege of doing at Mariner. I've created a series of workshops utilizing the financial planning emotional intelligence scorecard that you mentioned as really the crux of the training. So I'm meeting with advisors, spending 20% of the time teaching one of the communication skills in motivational interviewing. And then we're practicing for the other 80% of the time in small groups and giving each other feedback based on this scorecard. And why I think that is so helpful is because the emotional intelligence skills seem so abstract, kind of like, oh, you're really good at that, or like you could probably use some work in improving your active listening skills. That's so abstract. How do you work on that? That's where the scorecard helps. It puts structure and numbers and categories and, a Likert type scale to this, so we can figure out how to give structured feedback, and advisors can identify areas of weakness and areas of strength that they can work on.
So a couple of things that you said that I loved. One is, we started out this conversation by talking about the power of connection, relational skill, emotional intelligence to do things like finalize a sale, to build trust. But then to think about how we tend to lead with technical skills instead of the emotional skills. So to think about what percentage of my CE focus is on emotional skills versus technical skills. Like if I'm going to spend a couple hours learning about some new tax legislation, like am I spending just as much time learning how to connect with my fellow humans and help them to make better decisions, right? I think that's a powerful construct. So take the final shot here before I ask you to tell people where to find you. Take something from the scorecard, like some sub-facet of emotional intelligence. Tell us what it is and maybe give us a little homework that we could work on. Because I love what you said about these things. These will make you a better son, daughter, husband, wife, friend. You can do these at home. So what's one sub-facet of emotional intelligence that you think is powerful, and what's a way that the listeners could practice it this week?
Yeah. So my favorite for wealth advisors is the reining in the fix-it reflex. This is one I think is it's just a double-edged sword because they're coming to us for our advice, but yet giving the advice can be what is the proverbial foot in the mouth, like you give it too much or too soon. So one of the categories on the training that I do is teaching about what is the fix-it reflex and then practicing in conversation how to rein it in. And so again, to review what the fix-it reflex is when you see a financial problem in a conversation or on paper, don't point it out right away. First, work on understanding their perspective, and there will come a time for you to appropriately bring up the advice later on. And so in conversation, my challenge to all of you out there is when you hear something that you know to be wrong, or you have a solution for, or a personal experience to share that might help somebody, just zip it. Just let them go with it. Be curious about their perspective and understanding where they're coming from, rather than saying, well, actually, you shouldn't be using those online calculators because of this and that. And well, in my experience, I've learned XYZ. So that's probably my favorite category to highlight as we wrap up.
Yeah, one of the things that we teach in our course, I know it's consistent with motivational interviewing, is that any kind of, what we would call quote unquote irrational behavior, irrational money behavior, it always has a purpose. Like people didn't, get out of bed in the morning to be stupid or frustrating. And so like whatever they're doing makes some sort of sense to them. Even if we can flag that as, quote unquote wrong in our heads in a given moment, I think there's more power in understanding the why behind that irrationality than immediately trying to plaster over it. And I think our impulse is to fix it, like you said. So I think the homework that you've given is brilliant. Well, Dr. Christina, if people want to find you, if they want to learn more about your work, they want to follow you online, where can folks connect with you?
Yes, thank you again for the opportunity. Please reach out to me on LinkedIn. Love to connect with you there.
Beautiful. Thanks again.
Thank you, Dr. Crosby.
Thanks for tuning in to Standard Deviations. If you can't wait till next week for more behavioral finance insights, visit www.orion.com. All opinions expressed by Dr. Daniel Crosby and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of or endorsement by Orion and its affiliates, subsidiaries, and employees. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for legal, tax, and investment decisions. The opinions are based upon information the participants consider reliable.